Chapter 10.
The forest.
Rinoa heard that East Academy Station had originally been built as a stop point for a supply train between Dalit and Timber during the Timber War. Back then, it used to have a tent city that was full of Timber Army fighters and rebels. Nowadays, it was just a solitary train station seemingly in the middle of nowhere. It was obvious the train only stopped at it out of habit. It pulled away so quickly that they almost didn't have time to disembark.
So where's the forest?
Selfie asked, shielding her eyes from the sun as she looked west. She couldn't see a forest from here. She saw flat, dry grasslands, and long stretches of dry dirt with a background of cliffs quite a distance from the station. Besides the old wood and metal platform, there was nothing else. Not even a path at the end of the stairs for them to walk on.
It's a bit of a hike away,
Quistis said, earning a groan of unhappiness.
The flatlands are popular for reptilian monsters, so we'll need to be careful. Reptiles are weaker against ice,
Squall said as an aside to Rinoa as he loaded his gun blade.
It's the cold blood. But they're also fast and tough. I knew that,
Rinoa smiled.
You remember how to put blizzard on your weapon? Diablos! Will you put blizzard on my weapon, please?
Rinoa asked her new head companion. He was already laughing at her. She frowned.
What? You don't have ice magic? That was a trick question.
Squall said, and Rinoa made a face.
You always have to remember what you have and don't have. It can be the difference between life and death.
She sighed and nodded.
Diablos, can you put bio on my weapon?
He complied with that happily enough, and Squall nodded.
That's fine for now. So long as we're not fighting anything venomous or poisonous. Then that will actually be more helpful to the monster. You have to also know all the personal monster affinities and weaknesses. How can any one person be expected to know all that?
She asked, throwing up her hands.
You study, or you die,
he said mercilessly.
Shall we go?
Rinoa sighed again and nodded.
Squall, see that break in the cliffs there?
Quistis asked as she stepped down from the platform, pointing off into the distance.
That's where the forest is, in that small canyon. We pass through that on the way to the garden. All right. Selfie, I want you to take point. Aye, Captain.
She saluted him eagerly, jumping off of the platform instead of taking the steps.
Stop calling me that. Zell.
Squall hesitated in looking at him. Instead, he turned.
Instructor, I want you to take rear guard. Roger,
she nodded once.
Rinoa, you're with me. Zell. Are you good to fight? Of course I'm good to fight.
Zell snapped.
It's the only thing I'm good for.
Squall nodded, accepting that without comment for now.
Then let's move out.
Selfie ran off ahead of them as they all stepped down off of the platform and began the long walk towards the cliffs. It was a good position for her considering her boundless energy and desire not to take the well-trodden path. Quistis hung back, almost walking backwards completely as she kept her eye out for anything coming up behind them. Zell walked forward. Squall and Rinoa were just behind him, looking off to the sides.
Did you used to do this a lot back at Balam Garden?
She asked, smiling at him.
Fight monsters? All the time. It's the best way to train for combat. No, I mean lead squads. You were a leader back in Balam, weren't you?
He looked surprised by the conclusion.
No, I wasn't. This is the first time I've ever led anything. I was usually considered too much of a troublemaker to be a leader. A troublemaker?
Rinoa repeated laughing.
You? Now that I can't believe. Believe what you want. Come on. Tell me. How did a by-the-books, stodgy guy like you end up a troublemaker? Stodgy?
He repeated, somehow annoyed by adjective.
I got in trouble for fighting.
She opened her mouth then hesitated.
You know, that I could believe. Though I can't see you picking fights at random. Not your style. Did you stand up to bullies a lot?
What was she trying to do here? What was the point of this conversation?
No, I only ever fought with one person. Who?
He hesitated just a moment before telling her.
Cypher. I would fight with Cypher. Oh.
She pulled back slightly.
You two didn't get along. I wouldn't say that. So it was playful fighting. I wouldn't say that either.
She made a face.
Then what?
Squall shrugged.
Cypher was constantly starting stuff. I didn't let him walk all over me. Our personalities just clashed. I couldn't ignore him. No, I don't imagine that you could.
She smiled. And what was that supposed to mean?
Squall. Flock of thrusties coming up on your 7.
Quistis called out. He stopped walking and turned, his eyes scanning the sky.
Thrusties.
Rinoa repeated.
Thrustavis. Flying monsters. See them there? They must have spotted us from the sky. Yay! We get thrusty for dinner.
Selfie yelled, jumping up and down.
Ew,
Rinoa said as Quistis made a face.
Selfie, thrusty meat is disgusting. Nuh-uh. It's a delicacy in Trabia.
Rinoa mock-gagged as Selfie giggled. Squall ignored them and touched Rinoa's shoulder. He pointed off in the distance to the coming black lines flapping their way closer.
How many do you see?
Rinoa squinted.
4. 5. See that one second from the left, flying the lowest? There's one just behind him. You can see the difference when they flap their wings. How can you tell? They all have 4 wings. You practice. Everyone, spread out. Don't let them congregate. Selfie, please stop climbing the rocks. They'll all attack you at the same time.
Selfie pouted as she got down off of her newly acquired perch. Rinoa shook her head as she stepped away from Squall. Not to spread out as ordered, but to get out of the way. She wanted to make sure that Squall had enough room to fight. She wasn't a good fighter, she certainly wasn't seed good, she didn't want to slow him down by standing too close. A lesson she had learned the hard way from Cypher. Squall paused as he was drawing his weapon.
Rinoa, what are you doing? You stay with me. Why? Won't I get in the way? No. Now come here. Let me teach you how to kill these things.
Rinoa frowned as she hesitated. Squall just continued looking at her. His eyes were unreadable as always and she found herself so confused. Why was he trying to do this? Why obtain her a GF? Why teach her how to fight at all? She wasn't cut out for this. He wouldn't let her back away. So she returned to his side.
Quickly, before they get here, what's a flying monster's weakest point?
She cast her mind around quickly.
It's wings. Very good,
he nodded.
And ordinarily, you would be correct, thrusties are different. Their skin is like a rock. It's why they have 4 wings, to compensate for the lift power they lose in weight. For a weapon like mine, where I can put my own strength in the blow, it's not too much of a bother. Your weapon, though, doesn't use physical strength. So I can't fight them. Of course you can. You just have to use its weaknesses. There's a patch of very thin skin at the juncture between the 2 wings. If you can hit that spot, your blade can cut right through and into its heart. Are you crazy? I can't hit a target like that. Why not?
Rinoa stuttered. It seemed so obvious that she couldn't find the exact reason.
Well, it's just their wings beat so fast. And that space is tiny. That's a terrible excuse. Now get your blaster ready. Thrusties move quick and they land hard blows. We've spread out, so they will too.
What was wrong with him? Why wouldn't he believe her when she said she couldn't do it? It was unfair of him to hold her to his own standard. Despite that though, Rinoa hit the button to unfold her weapon. She was shaking as she kept looking over to him. His calm face and unaffected scowl were hardly reassuring. It almost felt like he was waiting to feed her to the thrusties. 5 thrusties. Enough for them each to have 1. The beasts beat their way across the air towards them, anticipating a feast. As Squall said, they spread out as they came in on approach so they could all take a meal. Squall and Rinoa had to deal with 2.
Squall, I can't do this,
Rinoa said frantically.
Not with that attitude, you can't. No, seriously. I can barely aim this thing. Watch me. I'll show you where to hit.
The big, blue bird came rocketing out of the sky. The spikes on its head were short, but they could gouge out large chunks of flesh. Squall didn't even blink. He brought up his revolver and the beast crashed against it. Squall's foot kicked back, then he used it to power himself and knock the thrusty down to the side. It started to roll, already twisting its body to get up and back into the air. Squall moved so quickly it took Rinoa's breath away. One boot slammed down against the tip of one wing, pinning it in place. The other pressed down on its neck to prevent it from squirming. His blade shined in the light of the sun as he lifted it up. Rinoa flinched as he drove it deep into the crease between the thing's wings. It let out a strange cry as Squall pierced its heart. Then its entire body went limp. Squall jumped down off of it and nodded, satisfied. He turned back to Rinoa and he wasn't even out of breath.
Did you see where I hit it? Maybe.
Rinoa was still panicking though. Her eyes looked around and she saw that the others were already quickly dispatching their thrusty. It wasn't even a challenge to these people. Quietus's whip wrapped around her's neck, allowing her to slam it to the ground. She released the whip, then brought it up and down again. The metal blade at the end sliced through the monster's neck, spraying blood quickly from its jugular. Selfie was laughing as she blunted her's attacks with her wildly swinging nunchaku. Each hit she pushed back only made the monster angrier. until it reared up for a big headbutt. Selfie jumped up onto the rock she had just abandoned and came down on top of it. Her weapon broke through its skull, she and it fell to the ground. Zell wasn't in any mood to play. He deflected an incoming blow. Then he reached out and grabbed the thing by the neck. He tackled it to the ground. His hands grabbed onto its face. A loud crack echoed over the flat landscape as he snapped its neck and broke its jaw in one jerking move. That left only Rinoa's thrusty. And it was his roaring at her in anger. Almost like it was blaming her for its fallen comrades.
Squall, please, I can't. Calm down. You're not getting anywhere panicking.
Squall's voice remained calm as he resheathed his gun blade. She only freaked out more when the shine of metal disappeared.
You have to kill it, Rinoa. I'm not going to do it for you.
What? He was going to let the thing eat her. How heartless could he get? Trembling, she lifted her blaster and shot the edge quickly. It flew wide and came back having missed completely. The thrusty hissed strangely. It almost felt like the monster started laughing at her. It dive-bombed and Rinoa screamed as she dropped to her belly. A rock cut into her side as the thrusty soared over her head and up again. She rolled quickly and scrambled to her feet. It was already turning to make a return trip. Squall, true to his word, was staying out of it. He was watching her with shielded eyes, his arms crossed. Not even the others were coming to rescue her. In fact, they were all giving her a wide berth. They didn't want to invite the thrusty to attack one of them instead. Rinoa felt like she was being left in a kill box. She was on the verge of tears when she shot her blaster again. This time, the blade skidded against the beast's wings. Squall, once again, was right. The pinwheel didn't even scratch the surface. Rinoa summoned the edge back again. Her heart was racing so fast she could feel her own blood rushing in her ears. She was so scared now that she was completely thoughtless. She was just a second from running and hiding behind Squall to force him to kill it. As soon as she had that thought, she felt a rush of calming energy from Diablos. She wasn't alone, he promised her soothingly. He was the great Diablos and she had him on her side, how could she possibly lose? She had to kill the thing or get eaten by it. So she needed to calm down and aim properly. He would help her. Rinoa was taking steps backwards as the thrusty climbed to do another dive bomb. Her arm came up and her weapon suddenly felt lighter. Like Diablos had taken all of its mass for himself. She could aim her own arm easily. The thrusty reached the top of its arc and started coming down, spinning as it did so. She couldn't hit it now, the wings were closed. Don't panic though. It has to open them again. Dodge it. Dodge it now. Rinoa's jump to the side was sloppy, she skidded painfully against the ground, and she felt her skin stinging when she came up. But the thrusty had dived past her. It was turning. Its wings were opening. Rinoa lifted her arm and pointed it at the bird. No way. She couldn't do this. Don't worry. He would help her. She just needed to aim it properly. She lifted her arm just a bit more so she was aiming to the side and above. Her eyes watched the beast as its wings beat the air. Beat. 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 Open. 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 Fire. The blaster edge burst from her arm. It zoomed around in a wide arc. Rinoa watched it go as she felt a sudden sense of weightlessness. Diablos was reaching out, taking her weapon. He didn't aim it, he couldn't do that. But as it came down, he increased the gravity on it. He made it fly faster. Hit harder. The thrusty's wings flapped with a snap and the space between them opened for just a second. Her pinwheel was a flash of silver as it sliced through. The thrusty reared up before falling to the ground, limp and unmoving. The edge, buried in its side, winked in the sunlight as she felt approval and pride coming from Diablos. She did it. She took it down. Squall was suddenly there at her side, giving her a very small smile. And now that it was dead, now that she could think properly again, she realized how stupid she was for thinking that Squall wouldn't have helped her. He wouldn't have watched her die. And all she had to do was order him to kill it and he would have. He had created an artificial feeling of needing to kill the monster to make her think she had to or die. It was a lie, but she had believed it in her panicking mind. And that had given her the motivation she needed. She laughed once, grinning back at him.
I did it. Congratulations,
he said, his voice calm and distant. And yet, she kind of believed he meant it.
Yay! Rinoa!
A weight slammed into her side as Selfie was grabbing onto her. Her own silliness hit her harder. Because of course none of them would have watched her die. She had let her fear cloud her judgment so badly. It was almost funny now.
Good work,
Quistis told her, stepping in close.
A bit sloppy, but effective nonetheless. When you're rolling away, try to control your fall more with your own body. It will prevent unnecessary wounds like those.
It wasn't until Quistis pointed it out that Rinoa remembered her own pain. Her arms were burning from the abrasions she had received skidding against the ground.
Have Diablos use a cure spell,
Squall said.
They're barely scratches. But they're still open wounds. Scratches don't worry me. Infections do. Use a cure spell.
She nodded and asked Diablos mentally to do so. He obeyed, still praising her skill. A rush of cool energy filled her as the pain lifted away. Her arms were still scratched, but they were healing. And any infection was being burned away in the magic.
So, can we eat them?
Selfie asked, pointing at the one Rinoa downed. Rinoa didn't like thrusty meat. It was slimy and tasted like rotting wood. But, just in that moment, she felt like it would be the greatest of victory feasts. Squall remained, as he always was, the voice of reason.
Selfie, you may strip them for parts, but we are not eating thrusty meat. The food at Garden is better than that stuff. There will be plenty of hunting between here and there and I'm sure we'll find something better. If not, I have plenty of rations that don't taste like sour cardboard. You guys just don't know how to prepare it right. Do you? Theoretically. Parts only, Selfie.
After they had gotten as much usable pieces from the thrusty bodies as possible, they began walking again. There was plenty of ground to cover. They all fell back into formation naturally. Even Zell, who still looked like he was rather out of it, did his part. Squall took the time to tell her about learning to summon Diablos' power. Each GF could use her as a channel to summon their own brands of attack without using up spells. It was just a matter of her being able to connect with him. Rinoa told him that she didn't really understand. So when they came upon another enemy, a short, stocky Grendel, Squall demonstrated with his own GF. Rinoa got to watch as his eyes flashed icy blue before he summoned a long tunnel of impossibly freezing ice. She got to feel Shiva wrap her up in her own protective cocoon before doing so. She didn't get to see Shiva herself, but she bore witness to her power. And it was incredible. The ice shattered and the Grendel was shredded by the shards.
How will I know how to do that?
Rinoa breathed in awe.
Diablos will show you. If you can connect closely enough with him.
What he didn't tell her was that it would take her a great deal longer with the only slightly familiar Diablos than it did him and Shiva. He also neglected to mention that the next time they came upon a Grendel that she was going to be fighting it herself. At that point, Rinoa was forced to go through the most honest, terrifying trust exercise of her life. The easiest way to connect to her GF was to close her eyes. Close her eyes? In front of a dragon-type monster with a metallic tail blade. She had to trust that the seeds around her were going to keep the monster away from her. Which, in theory, was easy enough. The reality of having a growling, crackling dragon monster that had an electrically charged breath that could knock down a grown man made it almost impossible to perform that simple act. Beyond that, she had to actually focus, on trying to contact Diablos in her own head. Though they were connected so close he didn't even have a physical body, it was still like trying to pick up wet soap with hands coated in slime. About a minute into it, she was focusing so hard that the battle around her was fading. She had absolutely no experience with summoning GFs. It was taking her that much longer to figure out how to bring out his power. Diablos was trying to help. She could feel him reaching out for her. They were trying to touch each other through a barrier of plastic that would bend and warp as they pressed against it, but they couldn't breach it. Until finally, they did. Rinoa's eyes snapped open as an unfamiliar, heady power rushed through her body. Her eyes were glowing bright red for just a moment as a sudden weightlessness overtook her. It was followed immediately by a plummeting in her stomach like she had lost count of steps on the stairs and her foot was falling through open air. But it wasn't a scary feeling. It made her feel alive. It made her hair stand up on end in the best way. It was an intoxicating feeling she couldn't get enough of. She could feel the power building up in her palm, begging for release. She remembered seeing how Squall had directed his palm. She attempted to copy the same movement. She threw her arm out like she was tossing the magic. The power of planets. Forces that existed without physical forms. The driver of the solar system and what affected all things. The power of darkness and gravity from the being between worlds.
Dark Messenger,
Rinoa whispered the unknown words with great familiarity. The world turned dark around her. Only her. No one could see Diablos as he descended from a sphere of darkness. No one could see his sphere of darkness. But Rinoa could feel it. The weight of it. The warping of space around it. She lifted her arm with Diablos and they grabbed the black sphere of density together. They pulled back, dragging space. She could see the Grendel before her, sniffing at the air as it felt rather than saw the changing of gravity around it. Like they were throwing a ball, Rinoa/Diablos reared back and, dragging against the cosmic forces, they threw the super-dense ball of gravity and darkness. No one could see it. But they could all see the Grendel as it buckled to the ground. Its heavily scaled body increased the power gravity held over it. It was crushed into the ground. Bones broke. Organs flattened. Its own body weight destroyed it. And the tenderized meat from the dragon was the best meal she had ever had. Distances were deceiving crossing the wide, grassy plains. Though it didn't look like the cliffs were that far away, it also seemed like they never got any closer. At one point, they hit a river and had to backtrack downstream until they could cross an old bridge across it to keep going. That set them back a while. Darkness fell while they were walking and forced them to make camp. Which, in turn, forced Rinoa to learn how to make a campfire, cook food over a campfire, and how to sleep by a campfire. Which, as it turned out, was a completely different thing than sleeping indoors on a bed. There were rules that just didn't exist while on a bed. Shoes had to be placed upside down. She had to be certain distance from the fire. One person had to be on lookout all night for nocturnal monsters. Consequently, she had to make sure that her weapon was always in reach. Squall didn't even remove his from his waist. It was also that night that Rinoa realized that she had never truly roughed it before. She thought it had been a downgrade to sleep on a run-down train with a resistance faction. She had even prided herself on how well she had adjusted. She realized now how funny that was. The run-down train where her friends had gone out of the way to bring in a comfortable bed and provide a lovely room was hardly roughing it. Out here, she was sleeping on the hard ground using her own arm as a pillow. There was no blanket, so she just got cold exposed to the wind. The seeds had no pity for her. They were sleeping the same way. Now she was no longer wondering how they could sleep in that tiny tech compartment in the owl's base. Now she was wondering how she was ever going to be able to sleep at all. When morning came again, she was shivering and sore from hiking and sleeping on the hard, unfamiliar ground. Diablos released a cure spell into her body without her permission, but she was grateful for it. Because Seed was not a forgiving organization. They were already moving by the time that Rinoa managed to pull her boots back on. They took little pity on her. No one offered to carry her stuff or carry her. They expected her to carry her own weight, which she struggled to do, but refused to complain about. She was going to succeed in this. She was going to overcome this weakness. She didn't realize that she was starting to hold herself to the Seed standard, or that it was completely unreasonable to expect her own body to do so. She was surrounded by seeds, she had to be able to keep up with them. Halfway through the day, they took a break to eat and rest. Rinoa nearly collapsed down onto the ground. Her muscles were twitching and tired. She wasn't breathing hard, but she felt like she had been beaten with bags of rocks.
"You doing all right?"
Squall asked, sitting next to her, holding out some rations. She was too tired to grab for it.
"I don't think I've ever walked this much in my life." "You're doing fine."
Squall broke off a piece and held it over her mouth, so all she had to do was let it fall in. Which she did. But she never knew chewing took so much effort.
"You don't know what fine means,"
Rinoa grumbled after she had swallowed.
"After about 2 weeks, you'll be more acclimated to this kind of activity. It won't seem so hard then. In 2 weeks, I'm going to be tanning on a beach in Balam wearing a skimpy bikini. I'm not going to be hiking across the landscape."
Really? Now that was a thought worth fantasizing over. And was burned into his brain. How was Squall supposed to think while imagining a nude Rinoa on a beach? Groaning with effort, Rinoa sat up and sighed.
"How do you do this kind of stuff?" "Practice. Here, eat.
She took another bite of the rations because it was there. She wasn't really hungry and it took so much energy just to chew that it almost wasn't worth it. However, Squall kept giving her bites and refusing to move until she ate.
We should be there soon, Squall,
Selfie yelled down at them from her vantage point on a hill they had stopped in the shade of.
I can finally see trees. I can't.
Rinoa was shaking her head at the next bite of food Squall offered.
I'm so tired. You're not going to be any less tired by not eating. You need to keep your strength up. The only way to do that is with food. You haven't had enough yet. Eat.
Nearly crying, Rinoa kept eating because he insisted. It wasn't really an enjoyable experience, but the travel rations were more for sustenance than taste. Then Squall had them walking again. Rinoa was so exhausted. She was just grateful that only a couple more thrusties attacked. Squall still demanded she take down at least one, but it wasn't so hard the second time. It was even easier the third. When she caught sight of the forest, she almost cried in relief. That meant that Galbadia Garden was just on the other side. They were so close now. To real furniture. Real food. Real showers. The modern comforts she didn't realize were so miraculous until this moment.
Squall.
Selfie called his name, pointing.
We've got movement in the grass over there. Think it's another Grendel. See the shine from its tail. No, but the grass is kind of high. All right, Rinoa. Squall, please,
she begged, panting slightly.
I don't think I can do it again. Have pity. I'm only human.
He gave her a small, half grin.
Very well. You can stay back and let us deal with it.
Rinoa nearly almost collapsed in relief. Selfie was laughing at her good-naturedly. Doing so, she was turned away from the monster moving in the grass. She didn't see it lift its large, boulder-shaped head. Or the one behind it. Or the one beside that one. 3 identical, rumbling roars like rocks bashing together. It wasn't the crackling roar of the Grendel or the hiss of the thrusties. All 4 seeds froze as they looked over. 3 Wendigos, big and strong and blind, raced out of the grass. They ran on their knuckles. The ground dented beneath the power of their strides. They had no eyes, but their hearing was so attuned they could hear a butterfly's wing from 10 yards away.
Dingoes!
Selfie screamed as she dove out of the way. Zell and Quistis sprinted away. Squall grabbed Rinoa's arm and ran with her.
Wendigos!
Rinoa repeated, her eyes going wide. She had heard about them, of course, but she had never had the misfortune of crossing one's path.
Don't stop moving!
Squall ordered before releasing her to let her move on her own.
Do not let one get a hold of you. If it gets you in its hands, you'll be dead before you can scream.
With that sort of warning, Rinoa found she had much more energy than she thought. She still stayed close to Squall though. She couldn't bring herself to separate from him.
How do we fight it?
Rinoa asked, breathing hard as the 3 Wendigos charged. One of them chased after Quistis. 2 charged after her and Squall. Rinoa let out a cry of dismay because they were a lot faster than she was pretty sure she was.
Zell!
Squall half ordered half yelled. The fighter was already hot on the tail of one of the Wendigos chasing after them. With a cry of effort, he jumped and landed on the thing's back. He grabbed hold of its neck with his arms and its torso with his legs. The Wendigo let out a roar of indignation as it thrashed. But that still left one chasing after Squall and Rinoa. Squall brought up his hand and threw a blizzard spell over his shoulder. A spire of ice pierced the ground right in front of the Wendigo. It didn't stop in time and barreled directly into it. The ice shattered from its heavy body. It was thrown down and struggled for a second to find its way to its large feet. Squall stopped then and turned to let off 2 quick shots from his gun. The bullets almost seemed to bounce off of its overly large head. He cursed as he and Rinoa turned to keep running away. A cry of pain from Zell alerted them that something had happened to him. His body flew across the open field and slammed into the ground with a loud grunt of pain. Zell almost didn't get up in time to get away as the Wendigo plowed into the ground where he had been standing. Running in nearly the opposite direction, Quistis's long legs were keeping her just ahead of the Wendigo attacking her. Directly behind the monster, struggling to keep up with her longer-limbed instructor, Selphie was panting as she tried to catch up. They were huge. And their skin was like rocks. And they were strong. Too strong. And that strength translated into speed that they almost couldn't escape.
Squall? Plan?
Rinoa turned to him, her eyes wide. Squall cursed again as he looked over his shoulder.
All right. Rinoa, slow it down. But, how?
Her weapon wouldn't be able to scratch that thing.
Use your magic.
He couldn't honestly expect her to. She had been fighting for all of one day, for Hein's sake. Calm down, Diablos whispered in her ear gently. He was the master of time and space. If she wanted things to slow down, Squall wouldn't give her a task she wasn't capable of accomplishing. She already had the means to do it. He had been the one to give them to her. Rinoa turned, throwing out her hands.
Diablos, slow.
She was scared, so her eyes closed. She knew she wasn't supposed to, but she couldn't help it. She just didn't want to see the monster that close to her face. Squall's footsteps halted behind her.
Perfect.
Only then did she feel safe opening them again. The Wendigo was still charging, but he looked like he was a video set on slow motion. Its large feet were pounding into the ground, still digging out divots of dirt as it did so. It still had the same amount of power, it was just going slower.
Blizzard.
Squall threw his own magic. A spire erupted up from beneath the beast, sending it flying into the air. It was moving slowly, but gravity around it was not. It plummeted to the earth and crashed down with a loud crunch of breaking rock. Squall was on top of it in an instant. Its hands, moving slowly, were already grabbing for him. Squall was like lightning in comparison to it. He slammed the point of his revolver down through the beast's heart. It required so much strength that Squall had to throw his entire body into it. Rinoa was breathing hard as she looked away from him to where Zell looked like he was breaking his knuckles, going hand to hand with the one that had thrown him. He wasn't trying to hurt it. He was just trying to prevent its ham fists from getting a hold of him.
Slow.
Rinoa commanded, pointing to him. The effect was instant. The Wendigo suddenly slowed in the middle of throwing a punch towards Zell's face. Zell didn't question or hesitate. He ducked under the Wendigo's slow-motion swing. He grabbed it by the middle and lifted up. The Wendigo barely started to struggle when Zell's back fell back and he drove the monster's head into the ground. Zell released him, turned, and delivered a bone-breaking punch to its back. Squall returned to Rinoa's side and nodded to her, satisfied. She smiled back, then frowned.
I can't hit the last one. Quistis let it too far away. Selfie!
Squall yelled at her over the distance growing between them.
Bring it back!
Selfie didn't show any indication that she had heard him. Until her nunchaku spun out and smacked against the Wendigo's leg, catching its attention. It roared, turning and chasing after Selfie now. She was already running, aiming back towards Squall and the others. Selfie was fast and she had a great deal of stamina. But the Wendigo could take longer strides. It was already closing in on her. Quistis, who had turned with them, whipped out her weapon, wrapping it around its leg. It pulled harder than she could, bringing her down. Quistis was dragged for only a couple of feet before she released the handle of her whip. Selfie dropped her nunchaku, trying to lighten her load to run faster.
Selfie!
Rinoa and the others were already sprinting towards her. Just a little further. They were almost in range of her magic.
Guys!
Selfie screamed. The Wendigo roared as its hand wrapped around Selfie's tiny torso.
No!
Squall fired 2 shots from his gun that bounced off of its head.
Slow!
Rinoa screamed desperately. Selfie's eyes widened on the Wendigo as it slowed down. She had time to scream now as it very slowly started trying to crush her.
Get her out of its hands!
Squall ordered as they all closed in on the beast. Zell arrived first. He grabbed the thumb and forefinger of the beast and started trying to pry its hand open again. Selfie was kicking and struggling against it, already having a hard time drawing in a breath against its tight grip. Quistis arrived next and lent her strength to his. Together, it seemed like their pulling was preventing its grasp from tightening further. Selfie was still having trouble breathing though because they couldn't ease it up any. Then Squall was there, pulling at its thumb. He was scared to try to use his blade for fear of hurting one of the others because it took so much force to penetrate Wendigo skin. His strength added to their though was enough to begin prying apart the vice-like grip. Selfie cried out in more pain as they very slowly eased the pressure off of her chest and abdomen. Rinoa skidded to a halt in front of them. She looked between them and the monster before closing her eyes and reaching deep inside. Selfie cried again as she finally could wiggle her way to freedom. She dropped down to the ground, wincing and struggling to move. Squall leaned down and gathered her into his arms. He pulled back, hauling her with him as the 4 seeds ran backwards to give the Wendigo a wide berth.
Squall, slow is wearing off!
Quistis warned as they stopped and turned.
Rinoa!
Squall set Selfie down gently. Despite that, she still winced. He was looking over to where Rinoa was standing dangerously close to the slowly speeding up Wendigo.
Rinoa! Do it now!
He ordered. Her bright red eyes snapped open at his command. She lifted up her hand and brought down the power of gravity against the Wendigo.
Dark Messenger!
She screamed as it was flattened into the ground. Silence stretched out, long and tense as the Diablos' magic faded. Rinoa's legs gave out from under her and she collapsed down, breathing hard. It was Selfie's groan of pain that broke the spell over them. Quistis and Squall both kneeled down next to her, frowning at the way she was trying to curl in around herself while simultaneously not move a single, aching muscle.
Selfie, what hurts?
Quistis asked, her hands hesitating over her body.
I'm out of cure spells,
Selfie said, grimacing.
I got you.
Zell moved in closer, leaning down.
Ifrit, cure.
The blue-green magic sank into Selfie's body and almost immediately she had an easier time pulling in a breath. Her eyes opened, but they were still pained.
Anything broken?
Squall asked shortly.
I can't tell. All right. Zell, you carry her and stay with Rinoa. I'll take point.
Being careful with her tiny, suddenly fragile-appearing body, Zell lifted Selfie onto his back and they began moving again. Selfie's eyes closed like she might be falling asleep. Rinoa kept her eye on her as they walked, worried. Rinoa, only having had them a short time, still had plenty of cure spells. She offered to split them, but Selfie said it wasn't necessary. So Rinoa also kept her plied with potions to keep any recurring pain at bay. In taking care of the injured girl, Rinoa sort of just forgot how tired she herself was. It didn't seem all that important anymore. There was only a single thrusty attack afterwards, which Squall dealt with expeditiously. They still couldn't reach the canyon by nightfall. Though they were so close it was almost torture. Rinoa could smell the trees on the air, could see them so close and tempting. But it was dark and they were all tired. Selfie needed to rest and let the cure spells Rinoa had given her do their work. Rinoa helped set up camp. Squall provided food. Quistis looked after Selfie. Zell was still being silent and distant. No one wanted to bother him. By the time Rinoa was laying down her head to sleep, she was no longer wondering how it was that seeds could seem to sleep anywhere. She was so tired the hard ground was a feather bed. She was asleep before anyone else and almost grateful for her own exhaustion.
I think it was just bone bruises,
Selfie said, stretching carefully.
I feel pretty okay. Yeah. Good,
Squall nodded.
Are you okay to walk? Can I take point again? I'd rather you hang back. I'll take point. Zell, you've got rear. Instructor, look after Selfie and Rinoa.
The team didn't question his orders and Squall tried not to think of how easily they were coming to him now. He just wanted to hurry up and get home already. The small forest was so close now. They were in the shadows of the cliffs. It wasn't even midday by the time that they made it to the tree line. He could hear Rinoa behind him letting out a sigh of relief. He resisted the urge to tell her that reaching the forest wasn't the point. They still had to walk to Galbadia Garden from the end of the forest. Halfway through, they stopped to drink at a small stream that nourished the trees. There was a well-worn path here telling Squall that people still traveled this road frequently. He imagined that Galbadia Garden students must train here sometimes.
How much further?
Rinoa asked, trying to peer through the trees.
We're not too far from Galbadia Garden now,
Quistis said, smiling.
It's a lot further from here to the platform than here to the garden. Hey, I was just thinking,
Selfie spoke up, looking between them.
What if we get there and the Galbadian government is already there? What if we get caught and then broadcast to the whole world? Ah! Whatever happens, happens.
Zell snapped at her. He actually snapped.
Now, come on. Let's just keep going.
They all looked at him as he seemed to deflate. He looked off to the side.
I'm worried about Balam Garden. If anything happens to Garden, it's all my fault. I'm the one who said we were all from Garden.
He suddenly looked up, pinning his pained gaze on Squall.
You think the president will retaliate on Garden?
Honestly, he wouldn't be surprised.
Maybe. Figures.
Zell seemed to deflate again. Then he was up, grabbing at Squall's shoulders, shaking him just a little desperately.
But, we have a whole bunch of seeds at Balam Garden. They wouldn't lose to the Galbadian army, would they?
Squall didn't appear bothered by Zell's manhandling.
Depends on how strong the army is. I know. But...
Zell released him once more, his shoulders slumping.
Oh, you're just a great leader, aren't you?
Rinoa asked venomously, glaring at him.
Do you actually have fun acting so callous towards your comrades?
Not this again. Why was she harping on this? Rinoa was stomping towards him, her face narrowed in anger.
Zell wants your support. He doesn't need you to cut him down further.
Yeah, he knew it was going to be that. He hated getting lectured.
Rinoa, it's fine,
Zell tried to say, but she cut him off.
Any kind of encouragement? I'm not saying you have to hug the pain away, but at least not stabbing him in the gut would be nice.
What would be the point in lying to him? The president very well might attack Garden, Squall didn't know for sure. And the Seed army was strong, but they weren't invincible. These were just facts. Why try to ease your mind when you couldn't know anything either way? Surely he wasn't the only one who thought that way? No. Cypher would think the same. He was sure. That wasn't exactly a pleasant thought.
Don't you ever worry about or even think about the well-being of your comrades?
She stomped her foot again. She did that when she was angry. Even though Squall found it cute, he didn't really care for being lectured. He also didn't believe in relying on others. Which was exactly what that peace of mind she was lecturing him about was. Relying on the lies of others. How apropos.
Don't you understand?
Rinoa shook her head at his blank face. Whatever.
Are you even listening, Squall?
Why did everyone ask him that?
Ugh!
Squall suddenly grabbed for his head. That sound. That high-pitched, whining sound that split his brain in two. It was back. It was not any easier the second time. Rinoa gasped and took a few quick steps back as Squall hit his knees. She tried to catch him before he fell into the dirt, but she was too slow. She ended up crouched in front of a now unconscious Squall, her eyes wide in terror. Quistis made a similar motion towards her head.
Me. Too.
Selphie groaned, swaying in the non-existent wind. Quistis dropped back first. Then Selphie curled up into a tiny ball in a soft patch of grass. Rinoa looked between them all, one hand reaching out for the unmoving Squall as her heart raced in fear.
What's going on?
She asked, looking back at Zell.
I think...
Zell frowned, leaning over Selphie.
I think they went back to that dream world. Dream world?
Rinoa repeated. End of chapter.